I believe that from Dan Houston's bump on Izak Rankine in the Showdown, that he will get. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Premiership Quarter. Today, I'm going to be talking all things Dan Houston. I'm going to be going through the hit and a little bit about where I think it might end up with the MRO taking it straight to the tribunal. I'm going to be talking about how that could end up with Houston's future at Port Adelaide, given if it does go to a 3 or 4 week suspension, he might never play a game for them ever again. But specifically, I just want to detail where I think it'll end up because it's a very contentious hit. A lot of people in the media have already talked about it, and I want to give my opinion on it as I'm really, really strong on the MRO and Tribunal and getting these things right because they dictate how players play the game. And that's what we watch. That's how we want to watch the game. How does it get mandated? And it's really important. And so, with that being said, if you wouldn't mind, please hit the like button and subscribing to my channel as well if you do like this type of content. But with that being said, let's get straight into the video.
It came up behind him like a librarian. Jesus!
I believe that from Dan Houston's bump on Izak Rankine in the Showdown, that he will get off. Yep, I don't think it will be a suspension, at least from what I've heard. I'll now take a look at it, but to be honest, from what I've heard, apparently there was actually no high contact made from the bump. And that's what it's about. If his head hits the ground, and that's what he got concussed from, then I believe that Dan Houston will get off. But I'm going to go watch the footage now and then come back and then I'll detail it. Now, just to preface this, I'm not going to show the footage as I have in some of my older videos because the AFL are shit shows with their copyright and it's horrible to try and get around. It's just not fun and I don't even want to try it anymore. And so I've taken a look at the footage and to say that he hasn't been hit high in Rankine, I think is a bit dubious because it, to me, looks like Houston's arm is what collects him high. Not necessarily his shoulder, which is what he leans in with, but probably more his bicep and tricep, more along the arm. And I'm, I originally thought that because there was no actual head-high contact from the bump, he would completely get off. But it now just comes down to whether the MRO and whether Port Adelaide can defend the bump and show that there was no actual head-high contact from it and it was just him hitting the ground. And the only reason I actually think that he might get off is because of the AFL and the MRO being such a shit show. I don't back the MRO to make the right decision in 95% of cases. And that's the only reason, as I mentioned, because the amount of times that we've seen people get off for things like this or get really bad or really low suspensions when they should have gotten higher it's farcical at this point. And there's also the fact that Charlie Cameron still got off for being a good bloke and Dan Houston is a good bloke. And so I think there's also, when you add that into it, it probably makes the matter even worse. I don't like it. Should he be suspended? In my opinion, yes. I would probably give him a 3-week suspension, depending on how much they can analyze and see how much contact was actually made. Because I want the bump. I want the bump in our game. I think it's a really important thing to keep the physicality in there, to let players have that edge to play with. We saw it with Adelaide and Port Adelaide in this game, where with some of the talk early on from Josh Rochelle during the week, there was always going to be some sort of physical alteration in the game, and we saw it early. That's what brings some excitement into the game outside of just watching the footy, and it's a big piece of it. We want entertainment as fans. That's what we're there for. We're not just there to watch. We want some entertainment. We want some great highlights in the game. We want some speckies. We want some fantastic goals. We want to see a physicality brought to the game, and if you're not allowed to bump, then some of that a lot of that physicality gets drawn back and it becomes a less viewable game. And if they do suspend this action, if they can prove that there is high contact, then good. But if they can't prove that the concussion was from the hit and that there was high contact, then and they still suspend him, I think there's something wrong because it incentivizes players to do the wrong things And if they do the wrong things and don't get punished for it, then you're clearly doing something wrong as an organization. Now, to just sort of go back to the Houston and Rankin hit and talk a little bit about where I think it'll be graded, because it's been graded as careless instead of intentional. And I kind of agree with it, kind of don't. This is where I sort of did my grey area in my AFL Deep Dive. Please go check it out. It will be linked in the description. I think that it's just such a weird act and such a weird way to describe an act as careless or intentional as the only two options. Now, he hasn't jumped, but he has gone for a bump. And to me, that seems intentional. But at the same time, I just don't understand how they haven't already graded it as intentional. Because at the time of the spoil, Dan Houston's basically outside the 50, and he has run full pelt into Izak Rankine, elected to bump him. And while he hasn't jumped and he stayed on the ground, stayed on his feet, he still got him around his chest and upper neck, chin area. And that's high enough for me to consider it as intentional, yet it's still not. And let me just say this again. The only reason why I think he'll get off is because Port Adelaide could convince the tribunal that the concussion was from him hitting his head on the ground. Because as you look in the footage, if you do want to go look at it, with his eyes, with Rankin's eyes, after the hit, they're still technically open. And when his head hits the ground, that's when he closes, and that's when his arms go into those positions where you know they're out, and it's just the body's natural reflexes doing that position. And so, if Port Adelaide do argue that, saying that he's still technically conscious, and then when his head hits the ground is when it's not, I think that's why he'll get off. I don't think it'll be because the hit's bad, because it is bad. It's something that is very dubious, and it's something that you probably don't want. It's probably a step too far. I think in a better world, in a world where we still want to be physical, but you need to know the limits of the game, that's probably a spear tackle. That's something where you absolutely smack him. You just go essentially shoulder right into his rib cage, just almost wind him. That should be your goal, not to almost kill the man because you're going for head high contact. And I'm not saying that's what Dan Houston did, but I just think that there were other options for him, and that's probably why he could very well get suspended. Now, this also brings into question the debate that has been going on for a fair bit of the year, where should we have a send-off rule? And I do not believe that we should. I don't like the idea. I don't think we should follow what the Premier League has done with the red card. While it is in the lower league, and I have never been given a red card, so I've got no bias. I personally just don't find it very valuable. I don't think it's enough because when you're playing, you know your risks. You know there is a risk of injury. And if someone goes up in a marking contest and hits someone in the back of the head with their knee, should that be considered a send off if the player gets concussed? Because I think it's just as bad. It's definitely just as dangerous. But are we going to have that as a rule in the potential send off rule? I wouldn't think so, but it's just as dangerous. So why wouldn't it be there? I don't think it will be regulated enough because in a case like this, where potentially the actual contact isn't what causes the concussion, then you've just ruined the team's potential chance of winning a game. If a case were to go to the MRO and then be wiped off by either good lawyers or just there not being reasonable argument, you may have just cost the team a chance at finals and potentially even winning a grand final if it's in a prelim and you're losing, let's say, a Patrick Cripps. Like genuinely, Cripps wouldn't have won a Brownlow. He also, well, Carlton obviously didn't make finals anyway, but they would have even have had him in that Brisbane game anyway. I just in a grand final, I if that happened, I don't think it should be in there. It does bring up the point, and I understand there's going to be a lot of talk about it, but I just don't believe that it will be worthy enough to have in our game because it's just not going to be implemented well, no matter how you want to use it. If it's a player coming off due to a really bad thing that they caused, like let's say the Tom Stewart hit on Dion Prester a few years ago, that could potentially be used for it. However, had he of slung someone to the ground and caused that a concussion, is that enough? It You need someone independently to do it, and it might take a few minutes, and they might injure themselves, they might injure someone else in them. I just don't see it having any value to being sorry. I see it having value. I just don't see it having enough value, and I see it having some drawbacks, and that outweighs any positive it may bring. So I don't like the idea of adding the send-off rule into the game. Now, what I find kind of funny is that David King has come out and said that this could be an 8-week suspension. And, like, I like David King. I think he says some really good stuff. I think he has a place in the media. But almost in a way similar to Kane Corns, he just says some stupid shit sometimes. He'll go on a really good point. He will talk about some really interesting things, but then he'll just add some stupid piece of information that is not necessary. Should this hit be in our game? Probably not. Is this hit suspension worthy? Yes. Is it one of the most dangerous and bad actions in the game? Potentially, because there's so much cause for harm. But is this one of the most lengthy suspensions in the AFL? No. We've probably seen incidents like this every other game in the round so far over the last couple of weeks. But there's just been better executed. And we've seen some worse actions throughout the entire year that, to be honest, haven't been graded anywhere near 8 weeks. Jimmy Webster's was 7. You're telling me that's worse than this? Like, I like you, David, but you just get it wrong sometimes. And it's similar to Kane Corns, where he just says some stupid shit to basically get headlines. I think that realistically it should be a 3 to 4 week suspension. Now, it was considered careless by the MRO, as I mentioned earlier, and that means it could be 3 weeks instead of the 4. That would be with intentional. And I personally, if it was an ideal world, I would like this to be a probably 4 match suspension, but with the case of finals being around the corner, it very well could be a 3 match suspension. And that could mean that if Port Adelaide's finished top 2, Houston would miss round 24, the qualifying final, and the prelim final. And then he'd be available for the potential grand final that Port Adelaide could make. Obviously, I'm not saying Port Adelaide will get there, but I think a 3 or 4 match suspension is the ideal world because it's just the wrong choice in this situation. I'm all for the bump, but in this situation, it probably wasn't the right choice. I still think that he will very well get off if I'm placing bets. That's what I'm going to. But it's like 55-45 at the moment, 55-40, and then like a 5% of him getting 6 weeks or something stupid, where the MRO just does something out of nowhere. But yeah, I think that this is potentially a game-breaking MRO case because there's going to be a lot of talk about it. It was in a high-profile showdown, high-profile game, and there's going to be a lot of talk given where Port Adelaide are at. And it'll also be interesting if this is potentially Dan Houston's last game for Port Adelaide, given the links to Melbourne and some other teams. But that is going to be the end of this video. I really appreciate you guys sticking around. I did sort of exaggerate the video to get it to 10 minutes, but oh well. I'd really appreciate if you guys would hit the like button on this video, really help push it in the YouTube algorithm. And if you wouldn't mind subscribing to my channel as well, as if you do like this type of content. But also, if you wouldn't mind leaving your thoughts in the comments below about this situation, and also where you might think Dan Houston will end up if he does end up leaving. But that's the end of this video, and I'll see you all next time.